Chapter 13. Crisis of Comburant. Year 0002, March 25th. The Department of Administrative Research. Renault exhaled deeply as he stepped into the control room. It smelled like gun oil, explosives, and a hint of coffee. Just the way he liked it. There was nothing like a hint of Java to start the day, night, or anywhere in between, in his opinion. The only thing better was if he could get away with adding a little something special to his cup of joe. "Am I late?" he asked, letting that nasally tone he used when he was being a real shithead seep in. He was pretty sure the answer was no. The only one there was Rude, sitting near one bank of terminals with a newspaper held up in front of his face. Renault tapped his electromag rod on his shoulder and sauntered forward into the control room, eyes scanning the computer screens. All of them showed various views of the Shinra building. Boring office workers buzzing around here, a glimpse of the entrance over there. Normal Shinra day. Normal Shinra hubbub. No fun. He wondered when his turn on night duty rotation was going to come up. If Rude was on morning shifts for monitoring the monitors, then that probably meant he'd have night duty pretty soon. Good. Renault grinned, ducking his head as he caught the back of one of the chairs and yanked it out, spun it around and straddled it. Night at Shinra was both the most boring time to be on the monitor and the best time. It meant a guy got the best chance at catching busybodies up to no good. On the flip side, it meant a guy got the chance to turn his attention to other matters. Renault liked to make a good use of it for his favourite snooping pastimes. The soles of his shoes and the chair he sat on squeaked as he turned it from side to side, watching a pair of third-class soldiers in the cafeteria playing a card game on a nearby screen. Renault. Huh? Renault looked over at Rude, only to meet the impenetrable stare of his shades over the folded paper he'd been reading. Rude's head tipped downwards a little towards the chair he perched on, and Renault stopped moving. The squeaking ceased. Rude gave an approving nod and flipped his paper back up, replaced with an image of Scarlet from a recent Shinra shindig. Sometimes Renault wondered why he put up with the guy. So stiff. But he guessed that was the point. Where he was laid back, Rude was serious. Where he was fiery, Rude was cool as ice. Rude was the power. He was the speed. They balanced out, worked good as partners. That was why they got assigned together so often. They made the most efficient team. After all, Rude lacked the interpersonal skills that Renault could provide, and Rude brought other things to the table, like being intimidating and quiet, and keeping Renault from going overboard. Yeah, efficient use of resources. Renault loved that about his job. There were other perks, of course. Lots of them. "So, Rude, buddy," Renault drawled. "Any idea what I've been called in for?" Today was supposed to be his day off. He'd been looking forward to heading down to the slums and spending a few hours in their pub in Wallmarket. Damn. "Status report," Rude offered. Renault turned his gaze upwards and scratched under the band of his goggles with the end of his electromag rod. "Dangerous? Maybe, but only if his finger slipped." "Nah, doubt it. Don't think that requires me to bring full gear." The paper dropped down, and Rude's shade stared at him. Renault pointed the tip of his electromag rod at Rude, then waved it around expressively when Rude ducked out of the way. Yeah, we're always in full gear." It was true. Each and every Turk took their job seriously. That was the point. That was why they were here. Someone didn't get to be a Turk if they didn't. At least they weren't one for very long. If a Turk didn't measure up, they were a liability, and the Turks didn't like liabilities. Shinra didn't like liabilities, and the Turks were usually the clean-up crew, the dark underbelly to Shinra's sleek steel and spit-shined outer shell. Renault drummed his short nails against the electromag rod's side, while Rude went back to his paper. There were a number of reasons Tseng could have called him in. Anything from avalanche activity to Operation Blondie and all the way along the list, from assassinations, extortion, controlling the slums, and something as simple as recruitment. Man, but Renault hated waiting. He just liked to get the mission statement, hit the road, and get shit underway. Except when he didn't. But a man had to have his priorities. There came a faint shush of the door opening a second before the precise click of shoes on tile. Only it wasn't just one pair, it was two. Renault looked over to see Tseng following Director Veld in. Veld, who carried a styrofoam cup of coffee in his hand, while Tseng touted a number of manila folders. So, not Operation Blondie then. He had to admit it was nice seeing Veld about. Having him get demoted, brief as it had been, was enough to give anyone a heart attack. Having to put up with Heidegger shuffling them about, he'd been about ready to ship out and put in his retirement papers. Well, no, not really. He doubted there was much that could ever get him to leave Shinra or the Turks. It was a cozy position, and he would probably never be where he was, if it wasn't for them. In all likelihood, he'd either be dead, a thug, or gutter trash trying to turn a quick gill from whatever he could steal or scavenge, or fuck knew what else. Shinra did that. It gave chances, even if it took some away. He'd always thought the good it did outweighed the bad. After all, they brought power. They brought light. And to some degree, they brought safety. Sure, not everyone agreed, but it wasn't his or Shinra's place to be nice and make friendship circles. It was their place to get the damn job done, whatever the job may be. A wise man just didn't ask too many questions in his type of business, at least in certain areas. His questions were for other places. Veld sat his cup down, and Tseng promptly handed a few of the folders out without a word. Renault lifted a hand. "Hey, Director." Giving him a short nod, Veld said, "Renault." His attention was already on the folders laid out before him, his fingers typing access codes into the terminal. "I think you ought to get to work." "On it," Renault drawled, as Rude gave his chair a kick that he was sure meant, "Leave the director alone." It also sent him rolling a few inches across the floor. He swiveled to give Tseng a smirk. "So, what you got for me, boss?" Tseng gave him a stare that was little more severe than usual. He always got his undies in a twist when the director was in the same room. Shame, really. Renault was pretty sure Veld, for all his sternness, had given up slapping him into shape years ago. That didn't mean Renault gave him straight sass, just edged around it a little. That man could be terrifying. "We," Tseng said, interrupting Renault's train of thought, "are going to have a look around Sector 8, and perhaps a few other places as well." "We," Renault echoed. Sure, it was normal for Turks to patrol around Sector 8. It was their territory. It was normal even for Turks, who'd been here as long as he and Rude, to be on the rotation. Tseng? Not so much. Tseng didn't usually do routine patrol and rookie babysitting duty. That was all theirs. "We," Tseng agreed. "Renault, Rude, let's go." Rude's paper rustled as he folded it, and Renault shoved himself to his feet, the chair spinning idly as he sauntered after the other two. Tseng led the way along the hall, neatly polished shoes tap-tapping away. Unconsciously, Renault mirrored the rhythm of the tap of his finger against the electromag rod's handle. Renault's eyes zeroed in on the back of Tseng's head, watching his ponytail sway. "Yo, boss! You on disciplinary?" Digging for information from Tseng was always a bit like a Turk's rite of passage. If you could get any right answers out of him, any accurate observations, it meant you were going somewhere. Of course, you had to level up through Renault first. "Not in the slightest," Tseng said. That meant it wasn't standard patrol duty, with a side of Tseng, then. "You heard from Shotgun lately?" "She's arrived safely." Which meant there was no news on Operation Blondie right now either. So that ruled out a meeting on the subject. Renault ran a tongue along the inside of his teeth. Sector 8 didn't have much going on a normal day. There was a reason that it was in the newbie zone. So, what was off? While he turned it over in his head, they arrived at the elevators and came to a halt. Tseng's ponytail shifted when he tipped his head forward to give them access to the elevator, and Renault sharpened his stare on him. A glance at Rude showed nothing but the usual impeccable exterior. Same old Rude, but Renault liked to think he could detect a hint of curiosity under that exterior. Every day he was getting better at reading him. He was already the best at it. Then again, it would take Shinra's third best Turk to be that amazing. Inside the elevator, Renault turned to face out the glass wall. Below them, Midgar spread out to the edges of the plate. A strange, abrupt horizon ringed by the outer edges of the Mako reactors, which glowed bright against the cloudy sky. He could hear the faint shift of fabric as Rude took up the space behind him. Tseng was a silent, smaller shadow near the doors. His stomach swooped as the elevator began its descent. "You gonna tell us the lowdown, or are we gonna have to find out on our own?" He heard Tseng give a faint hum, as if he was considering it. "We're going to investigate the remains of a burned-down materia shop in Sector 8. "Oh, that." He'd heard about that on his way in today. It took a second before it really registered, and Renault craned his head around to look over his shoulder. Rude's broad frame blocked his view, so he turned away from the view of Midgar to slip around him. "Wait a minute, a burned-down materia shop? That's it?" he said, indignant. Renault gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "Send a rookie." Tseng's dark gaze landed on him. "Stand down, Renault." With a grumble, Renault subsided and turned back to the glass walls to watch Midgar rise up to meet them. A few more floors and the building engulfed them to cut off the view. Tseng's smooth voice filled the quiet space. "We suspect arson. It isn't the only shop to find itself completely burned out within the past few weeks. There's also been a warehouse and a parts shop in the number, all of which connect back to and are supplied predominantly by Shinra rather than by private operations." That made more sense than just investigating arson. As much as the Turks kept an eye on things, their concern was Shinra. If it was in Shinra's interest, then it was in theirs. "Still don't see why you can't get one of the rookies to do this. Rude and I have more important things to be doing. Recruitment, stalking blondes." "Well," Tseng said. The faint undertone of amusement in his voice immediately put Renault on alert. "I could always send you out to help look for more information on Avalanche." Shit. He had him there. "Except," Renault smirked, "or you can let us get back to snooping around Lazard." He could see Tseng's reflection in the glass. His head turned just enough for Renault to make out the pale line of the side of his face. "I thought you turned in the report on that already." "I did?" Renault asked, blankly. Nearby, Rude cleared his throat uncomfortably, and Renault whirled around to gape at him in betrayal. "Rude! No way!" Rude shifted, shoulders hunching and head ducking. The elevator swayed to a halt, and Tseng announced, "Ah, we're here." Tseng disembarked, and Rude hurried after him, steps just a bit too quick. Renault, left alone in the elevator, continued to gawp at his back. "Traitor!" he hollered after him, throwing himself after the two at the last second and slipping between the closing doors. He caught up with them in a few seconds and fell sullenly in beside Rude. Tseng, the smug bastard, seemed to have developed a bit of a bounce in his step. He'd been enjoying that job. Ferreting around Shinra's dirty secrets had always been his favourite. Renault liked to have his finger in all the pies, and Lazard's pie with its shiny, glistening crust turned out to be pretty deep. And pretty nasty. Shinra's good boy director of Soldier had a lot going on under there. Tseng cut across to the entrance, and the three of them filed out of the Shinra building and into Midgar's streets. Renault breathed in the Mako-scented air, the smell of exhaust from construction machines, and the scent of food floating from a few carts parked along the road to take advantage of the commuters heading towards the Shinra building. Renault took in every bit of movement, every face that went by him. He recognized many of them, knew most of their names, or at least their jobs. It was a Turk's duty to know who came and went from Shinra and why. Around them, Sector 8's buildings rose up, tall brownstone with windows full of light. Light that Shinra provided. That was what Shinra did. It provided light, power, work, safety, and money. Shinra offered stability, and maybe a few people had to get stepped on or disposed of to make way for the better world that Shinra was paving. But that was just business. Reno had learned a long time ago that to get ahead in life, sometimes you had to step on a few toes. It was survival of the fittest at its finest, and Shinra was the biggest predator on the block. In its early days, Shinra had gobbled up all of its rivals, and it kept on gobbling them up. It was good work for the Turks. All they had to do was make sure anyone who got ideas of challenging Shinra's power, well, they tended to disappear. That was the way of the world, and Reno couldn't say he didn't enjoy being near the top of the food chain. They cut across the Fountain Square and into Loveless Avenue, though their stay there was brief. Reno counted the number of troopers on patrol in the area as they passed through and off into the streets beyond. The streets off of Loveless Avenue were lined with two-story buildings, shops shoved close together with multicoloured awnings over wide, tall front windows. Reno absently glanced at each as they passed. One sold clothes, another displayed delicate confectionery designs, and a third advertised tobacco. On they went, past convenience stores, a small liquor shop, and down another road. The traffic grew lighter, the everyday shops giving way to more specialised ones. Electronics there, a pawn shop a few doors down, a store with an array of knives and guns in the front window, and more weapons on the shelves beyond. It wasn't hard to spot their destination. It had been cordoned off, a number of Shinra's troopers standing guard to make sure smartasses didn't sneak past and try to get into the ruined building. As they grew closer, Reno could smell smoke. The materia shop was still smouldering, smoke rising from the burst windows, and scorch marks licking from them like a dragon had roosted inside and started spewing fire out. Singh came to a stop before he stepped into the water that pooled on the street, slowly running down the nearby grates and into the plate's dispersal pipes. The wood around the front door had caved in entirely. "Casualties?" Root asked. "4," Singh answered, picking his way across the wet pavement. He ducked under the vivid yellow tape and headed towards the storefront. The troopers barely gave them a glance. The shop owner, his wife, and 2 children. Reno made a faint noise in the back of his throat. Rude pulled the tape up, and Reno used the chance to swing under past him before Rude followed. "Well, it's a fixer-upper, but hey, prime real estate." The lot would be filled in fast. Greedy folks vying for better positions. Closer to the Shinra building, and closer to more traffic. Not to mention anyone in the slums with bright eyes for a better future, and enough money to buy their way plateside. Did they already secure the materia? Tseng made a noise of affirmation. They found the bodies while looking for the shop's stock records. Were they able to find them? Reno stopped beside Tseng, observing the shopfront more closely. Chipped brick littered the ground under the scorched-out windows. The glass crunched under Rude's step as he moved in closer. Yes. That was good news, at least. Reno didn't envy the poor bastards who'd have to cross-reference the removed stock of materia with the shop's paperwork. They couldn't have loose materia, not around here. It could be a reason for the arson, though what they wanted from a warehouse and a parts shop, well, that was what they were here to find out. Reno heard the sound of a commotion near the perimeter behind them. One of the infantrymen barked, "Sir, you're not allowed in this area right now. Please step—" "Hey, take it easy. I'm just going to have a word with Tseng. Come on, Cloud. Let's go see what happened." If that wasn't Zach Fair, Reno was going to actually get his shoes polished and tuck in his shirt. He did perk up at the sound of that name, though. Where Fair was, his little blonde shadow was close behind. "Hey, Rude," Renault drawled, tilting his head and jerking his chin in indication. He didn't bother to turn towards the familiar voice. "You want to take care of that?" Rude nodded, disappearing out of view as he headed to intercept the intruders. As interesting as the pair were normally, this was Turk business. Nobody got to interrupt Turk business. "Oh, hey, Rude, just wanna, get by you, you know. Can you move out of the way?" A brief pause, and Renault could imagine that impeccable shaded stare. "Aw, come on." Over the sounds of Fair trying to find a way past Rude, Renault was aware of a quiet rustle and abruptly realized someone was standing a few feet behind him. Renault tensed minutely and didn't wait to see if his personal space invader was going to do anything. He whipped around, his electromag rod sparking with a charge as he aimed for the head, and kicked out with one long leg in the same movement. Instead of the meaty sound of metal against skull, or even the clang of metal on metal as his strike was blocked, Renault was only aware of blonde hair ducking under the swing of his rod, and the next moment a hand closed around his calf and yanked him further around with a pull. He spun in the air, the street and overcast sky flinging by in a blur. If he didn't do something, he was in for a nasty landing. He shot out a hand to push off the ground and gain control of his spin, getting his feet under him as he landed in a crouch. His electromag rod clattered loudly against the cement a few feet away. Straightening and brushing at the lapels of his coat, he attempted a nonchalant expression. "Whoa, nice reaction time, Blondie." Strife looked back at him, apparently not bothered that Renault had just tried to stave his head in. Over his shoulder, Renault could see Fair push past a distracted Rude. "Nice backup, partner." "He learns fast," Fair said blithely, then waved. "Hey, Tseng!" "Zach," Tseng returned mildly. "Do you need something?" Renault turned his attention on his current favourite puzzle and Shinra enigma. Strife appeared unaffected by Rude's presence looming over him. For his part, if you were to ask Renault, Rude looked very put out at being ignored so successfully by the two trespassers. Ignoring that, it was pretty interesting that the blonde was so composed in the middle of a group of Turks. Everyone from the lowest janitor to the top executives tended to walk on spun glass when Turks had business in their vicinity. Except for Fair, of course. Renault could hear him harassing Tseng, and didn't envy the boss his position. It was interesting to get a look at Strife close up. The last time had been way back in December, and he'd only seen him in photos since then. If he were to hazard a guess, Renault might say that Strife looked better. Pale still, but it was the complexion a lot of northerners sported. He didn't look like someone who could keep up with Sephiroth, though. That was for sure. Strife was on the short side, a little reedy. Looked like he hadn't quite grown into himself. He probably hadn't, given the age on his personal file. Strife sported those creepy glowing eyes that all soldier did, however. That, coupled with his near-blank expression, did lend a more imposing presence than scrawny teenager too big for his britches. And he was carrying around one of those cheap weed whackers they handed out to the soldiers like candy. Seriously, the budget for equipment was ridiculously high in that department. Renault may have had a specifically modified and expensive, exclusive to him only weapon, but he took care of it. Speaking of taking care of things, a word of advice: don't let Fair teach you bad habits like crashing a Turk party. It'll get you further around here, Renault drawled. He watched, keen-eyed for any reaction from Strife. Anything at all that could give a hint towards if he was interested in climbing the ranks. That was normal in Shinra. That was wanted. Shinra liked to encourage a little survival of the fittest among its employees. It just gave them character. On the other side of the coin, Renault jerked his head at the burnt-out building nearby. Or are you just returning to the scene of the crime? Strife turned his head in the direction Renault indicated, but whether he was taking in the blackened husk or had indigestion, Renault couldn't tell. "I've never been here before," Strife murmured blandly, giving Renault nothing to go on either way. He was doing a good job at making Tseng look like an open book. "We were on our way back to the apartments," Fair said, stepping into the conversation as if he'd been there all along. Renault made a note of that. He seemed to keep piping up when anything was addressed to his little strayed trooper, and Renault couldn't help but wonder. "I was supposed to meet a buddy of mine for some extra sword practice 10 minutes ago. Oops." Renault stared as Fair stepped away again, taking his phone out and dialing. Tseng drifted in as if he'd been waiting for the chance and took his place. He levelled a cool look at Renault. "Don't cause a scene." "Hey," Renault complained. "I wasn't the one who started causing scenes. That's all on him." A thumb jerked at Fair, just as a loud, "Hey, Luxia, sorry about the wait. There's a situation," punctuated the conversation. Right on time. Good to know Fair could be relied on to make his case for him. Tseng released a breath. He had a good point regardless. He jerked his head towards the burnt-out building. "We need to have a look at the damage." Renault looked back towards the building. "Yeah, we'll get right on that, but—" "Renault." Strife's voice cut in, and Renault turned just in time to prevent his electromag rod from smacking him in the face. He fumbled it, shaking out his stinging palm, and glad he'd not caught the on switch. "Hey, watch it!" Renault yelped, and shot a glare at the blonde. He wasn't sure, but Renault swore he saw Strife hiding a smirk behind his trooper scarf. That little brat! Forget what he said about him being mature. Strife was obviously still a snivelling teenager. Tipping the end of his electromag rod towards Strife, he gave him a sharp look. "Why don't you go over there with your noisy handler and stay out from under our feet, 'kay?" Strife stared Renault down for a couple heartbeats longer than was strictly comfortable, like he wasn't waving a dangerous weapon in his face, before he turned away dismissively. Not to leave, Renault noted, but to move closer to the burned wreckage. "Hey," Renault called after him. "What did I just say?" With a huff, Renault looked over at Rude. Rude, who hadn't moved a muscle the entire time. "Can you believe this guy? Get this joker out of here." Rude's eyebrow rose visibly above his sunglasses, and his entire expression, the bits of it Renault could see at least, screamed, "I'm not doing it." Renault waved a hand at him in a shooing gesture, and jerked his head at Strife. Rude shook his head at him. Insubordination everywhere. If it wasn't one of the rookies, it was his own partner. He saw how it was. "Renault, Rude." Tseng's voice broke through Renault's attempts to silently convince Rude that, yes, he needed to do this, in the face of Rude's continued refusal. "Yeah, boss?" Renault asked. At the same time, Rude said, "Sir?" Tseng turned and headed towards the building. Zack suggested the damage looked like that done by Wutai firebombs. "Get on it." Right, back to duty. With the last long look at Strife, Renault followed after Tseng. "Hey, Rude, give me a leg up, would ya? I can probably get up to the second floor easy."
Renault didn't change, Cloud reflected. Tseng at least looked a little less lined around the eyes, and even Rude wasn't quite the muscled mountain that the world-threatening events would hone him into. Renault, though, looked like he'd stepped right out of the future to harass Cloud again. Even the way he greeted Cloud had been a familiar song and dance. The only difference was the lack of a long ponytail he'd sported. It made it somewhat difficult to hold his tongue against the sarcastic barbs the Turks' presence always inspired. For all their hands weren't the cleanest, the Turks as a whole weren't bad people exactly. The fault lay in their loyalty to the wrong people. Unlike Sephiroth, who wasn't yet the man who could destroy the world out of insane hatred, the Renault of now was exactly the same as the one who'd pushed the button to send Plate 7 crashing into the slums below, just because it had been an order. Yet Cloud had to keep in mind that Renault hadn't done that yet, that he might never have to if Cloud played his cards right. It had still been satisfying to send him flying. The amalgam of past and future was incomplete, however, without the fresh-faced Elena flitting around her senior Turks, eager to help restore the group's reputation. She would have been useful here, as she always gave away more information about what they were up to than any of the others. Renaud did too, eventually, but it was rarely worth putting up with his attitude to get it. It was always good to know what the Turks were up to, since they were usually right in the middle of the biggest conspiracy. All in all, Cloud felt pretty surreal as he watched the Turks climb about the burned-out shell of what had been a materia shop. It was too familiar, too similar to interactions Cloud had had in his past future, and only Zack's grounding presence reassured him that he wasn't lost in a twisted memory. Bits of debris crunched under his boots as Cloud wandered aimlessly, waiting for Zack to finish his phone call. He wasn't sure why they'd stopped here, aside from the fact that Zack was naturally curious about anything out of the ordinary, and it was impossible, or at least impractical, to stop him when he caught the scent of something interesting. That, coupled with the Turks, was enough to pique Cloud's interest as well. He didn't see what was so unusual about the ruined shop, however, except maybe the lack of damage to the neighbouring buildings. They were so tightly packed together that it was strange for the fire to have been so contained. Probably why the Turks were snooping, since it didn't seem to be a natural occurrence or an accident. Cloud's steps took him by Rude, who was looking up to the upper levels, where Renaud was still scrambling about. As expected, Rude didn't say anything to Cloud, though Cloud caught the glint of a man's eyes from the side of his sunglasses, where Rude shot him a sideways look. That was the nice thing about Rude. He didn't say anything excessively, but you could read his moods all the same. Right now his entire posture was screaming curiosity and irritability. At least a small part of that had to be Cloud's fault. The majority was probably more due to things like the singed piece of wood that just bounced off his head from Renaud's bumbling about.
Yo, Rude!
Renaud hollered from above. Cloud glanced up to see him lean out away from the burned window. He nearly toppled as he dropped something. This time Rude caught it in his fist rather than his head, and Cloud wasn't able to make out exactly what it was before he tucked it away into his jacket. A moment later, a pair of arms closed around him, yanking him backwards. He kicked back automatically, his arms pinned to his sides. The sole of his heavy boots hit the shins of his attacker, and Zack's sudden laughter was intermixed with a pained yelp that sounded right in his ear. He should have known.
Zack.
His boots weren't even on the ground anymore.
No fair.
Renaud's voice called down.
The noisiest soldier in the lot can get the drop on your scrawny ass. And you make me look bad? I'm offended.
Zack gave him a squeeze, still snickering, and hollered back.
You're wrong, Renaud. It's all fair here.
Cloud just kicked him again.
I'm pretty sure that joke's expired. Renaud.
Tseng's voice cut across the impending argument, sounding entirely world-weary.
Get back to work.
Wriggling, Cloud managed to loosen Zack's hold enough that he could stand on his own 2 feet again. Seriously, Zack? He hissed, but cut himself off as Zack used his grip to drag Cloud away from the congregation of Turks. When he'd deemed them far enough away, Cloud dug his heels in and tugged himself away. Frowning, he crossed his arms and shot Zack a look that demanded explanation.
I told Luxia we'd have to meet him later,
Zack said in an undertone. He jerked his thumb towards the Turks and the burned building.
I want to stick around here and see what's going on.
Raising an eyebrow, Cloud nodded agreeably.
Trouble?
He asked, cautious despite the distance between them and the Turks. Turks had long ears. Zack rocked back on his heels and rubbed his palms together.
Maybe, maybe not. But when it comes to something that looks like Wu-Tai work, I want to know.
He slanted Cloud a sidelong look.
I've got enemies. Ah.
Cloud frowned at the reminder. Zack, for all his easy camaraderie, was a dangerous person to be on the opposite sides to.
What makes you think it's Wu-Tai? You ever see the damage done by a Wu-Tai firebomb?
Cloud flicked his eyes towards the Turks, not answering the question. That should be answer enough to Zack.
Yeah, well, it's got all the markers.
Zack breezed on.
No damage outside what they want, directed. That particular burn pattern around the windows. And there's some scraps of the containers they use if you look.
He lifted a hand and pointed towards one of the upper windows, where a bit of bright yellow clung that didn't look like much, but to the trained eye. Zack inhaled deep.
There's a particular scent to them as well, you know?
He did know. Yuffie had played around with small, homemade firecrackers, but spoke fondly, too fondly, of the larger, more professionally made explosives of her hometown. It was a grittier, chemical scent that fire or magic-induced fire didn't carry. Now that he was looking for it, he could detect the faint scent in the air under the cleaner smell of burned wood.
When I went into Fort Tamblin,
Zack said, voice barely more than a breath,
I let a member of the Crescent unit go alive, and he promised he'd come for my head eventually. So if we have Wu-Tai insurgents getting into Midgar, I want to know if I have to sleep with one eye open.
A surge of adrenaline shot through Cloud as his gaze sharpened at the knowledge that Zack might be in danger. That was definitely something he could get behind, bothering the Turks over.
You don't mind hanging around, right?
The last part came out louder than the rest, but Cloud gave a sharp smile in return. He wouldn't admit it out loud, but he was getting a little bored hanging around Midgar, doing piddling little missions. This was both interesting and also meant he could look out for Zack's back if he was in trouble.
Hey, hey, hey!
Renault's voice cut in. A sharp clack announced him landing on street level again, and Cloud looked over to see him saunter towards them.
No one invited you chumps to the party, you hear?
Renault brought his electromag rod up, letting it thwack solidly against Rude's chest. Rude's head jerked slightly, the only sign he made that he'd even felt it.
We got Rude for the Brawn Fair, and I don't think you're going to bring much in the way of brains to the operation. No wonder Seng's here, then.
The words were out of Cloud's mouth before he could censor them. He could sense Zack tensing up behind him, and mentally cursed his slip. He wasn't supposed to know them that well. Renault's brows shot up, nearly disappearing under his goggles, though his shock passed in a second.
Cold. Real zinger there. You think you can keep up with the Turk?
Then again, it was Renault.
Better than you can keep up with me. You're a real hoot.
Renault lifted his electromag rod up in a ready position, looking for all the world like he was 2 seconds away from launching himself at Cloud. Narrowing his eyes, Cloud shifted his stance to a more ready position himself. That was fine by him, if Renault wanted to get his ass handed to him again in as many minutes. Before anything could happen, Rude stepped up behind Renault and grabbed him by the back of his shirt to haul him away. At the same time, Cloud felt a hand at his own collar, lifting him up and back. Zack's voice in his ear going,
Whoa, 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 you two. No fighting in the streets.
Seng walked between the two groups, snapping his phone closed as he said,
Children.
Cloud flushed, irritably aware that he had been acting a fool. However, if Zack didn't let him down in the next second, he was going to see just what soft spots he could hit from this height. Zack seemed to sense his mood, and dropped Cloud ungracefully to the ground. He straightened his scarf in an attempt to ignore Renault's smug expression across from him. Seng's next words wiped it right off Renault's face.
We'll discuss this later, Renault. For now, if you're finished, Gunn is meeting us in the Fountain Square with the files on possible Wutai spies in Midgar. Mind if we tag along?
Zack called after Tseng. Tseng glanced back and lifted a hand to wave him to follow. As they caught up with Tseng, Zack positioned himself between Cloud and the rest of the Turks. Though he did it so casually, it looked like he just happened to wander there. Cloud wasn't the least bit fooled. He wasn't a child who couldn't control themselves. It was just that, well, it was Renault.
It's a mission that was going to wind up in soldiers' hands originally,
Tseng said to Zack.
We're picking it up now to expedite things in the face of recent damages.
Zack held up his phone.
Is it in the system?
At Tseng's nod, he pushed a button on his phone and began checking it over.
I'll pick it up then. Good. That will prevent futile actions on someone else's part. Shinra efficiency,
Cloud muttered under his breath.
Ain't it beautiful?
Renault's nasal twang still sounded too smug. Cloud tried to shrug off his irritation at being overheard.
It's something, all right,
he replied neutrally, and then Zack elbowed him hard enough to make him stagger. It still surprised Cloud on occasion that there were people here just as strong as he was, just as able to throw that strength around. The shock wore off quickly, and Cloud turned his glower on the side of Zack's face. His irritation quickly faded, as he was unable to hold a grudge against Zack, who was just trying to keep him from slipping up in front of such Shinra loyalists as the Turks. That aspect hadn't changed much, from now to the future. What had changed, what Cloud was only just coming to realize, was Shinra itself. The company that Cloud had fought against, whose efforts against Sephiroth and Meteor had been futile at best, had been nothing compared to the Shinra of now. Now it was at the height of its power, with an army of trained soldiers at its beck and call, Mako energy still fresh and seemingly bottomless. It was organized and ambitious and active. Rufus had been right about one thing, at least. His father had let Shinra stagnate, was too content in his glass tower and unquestioned power to see the company was on the brink of destroying itself and the planet. The corruption of the land that surrounded Midgar in the future was a clear indicator of the harm Mako energy had produced, and was ignored in favor of finding the mythical Promised Land, an endless land of resources Shinra could use forever. Cloud knew better, of course. But what had changed the president from the intelligent man who was able to create and hold such an empire to one who would follow such a hard-to-believe story? Compared to now, with Shinra's recent defeat of Wutai and heavy activity around the planet, it was such a great contrast. Reluctantly, Cloud could admit that Rufus's vision for Shinra then was better than the reality of now. Not his initial dream of ruling the world through fear, but the humbled plan to rebuild Midgar and work with the planet to heal it and its people. He wasn't stupid enough to think that Rufus hadn't had an ulterior motive, hadn't intended to come out on top of that, with as much power as he could grab. There would always be those trying for control. After Meteor, much of that had been tempered into a sense of gratefulness at surviving, which had in turn soured in the face of the Geostigma plague. It would have been better to start over, for Shinra to let Midgar be swallowed back into the planet, and let the people build anew. Unfortunately, the people were scared and congregated towards what was familiar, what had once been safety. Edge City hadn't been necessary. People just couldn't let go of the remembered strength and power Midgar once held. Calm would have been a much more viable, much healthier option to build if the people had just tried. Cloud would have helped, had helped the few who had made the journey. That was all gone now. The Shinra of now was an efficient machine that took as much out of the world as it could, without care to what it destroyed in the process. As he told Zack, it was inevitable that Shinra would fall. Too much was consumed without being replaced, and the company would run out of planet, people, and power to exploit. Cloud had tried his best to stop the destruction before the planet had been irreparably harmed, and failing that, had done what he could to soothe the wound. He and his friends had worked hard for that future. Maybe this time he could prevent the damage in the first place. A sharp pang of homesickness struck him. He would never see his willful Tifa again, or quiet Denzel, or cheerful Marlene. Sid was a Shinra man who cared more about the stars than what lay beneath them. Barrett was somewhere, working hard for the betterment of Shinra, not yet touched by bitterness or hatred. Even if Cloud were to meet them here, it would never be the same. Those people were lost to him. In a bitter haze, Cloud looked up and realized they'd made it to the fountain square while he'd been lost in thought. A short, blonde-haired woman dressed in a dark Turk suit was waiting in the courtyard ahead of them, her back still turned to their approach. His heart gave a little leap of recognition, even as he couldn't believe it. Surely it couldn't be Elena here. Not now. She'd been a new recruit in the future, and would be too young for the Turks. Then the woman turned, and while the face was similar, it wasn't Elena that greeted Zhang with a sharp salute.
"Sir, your files." "Thank you, Gun,"
he replied, taking the manila envelope and tucking it under one arm.
"I apologize for calling you out here on a simple errand." "I'm happy to provide assistance, sir,"
Gun said, with a sharp nod.
"If you need anything else, let me know." "Actually,"
Zhang said, holding up a hand to prevent her from turning away,
"you've been gathering information on the movements of our targets, correct?"
Cloud bristled at the choice of words, but tried to suppress his distaste. For now, it was just like the Turks to use such a dehumanizing term. Gun nodded an affirmative, and Zhang continued.
"I'll need your assistance on this job. We need to flush out as many of the Wutai insurgents as possible, now that their threat has escalated."
Turning back to Zack and Cloud, Zhang continued with a faint smile.
"Zack, playmate." "Sure thing."
Zack gave a cheerful pair of thumbs up, stunned for a moment at how ridiculous such a request from Zhang was. It took a moment for Cloud to register Zack's enthusiastic reply. He kicked Zack's ankle in irritation at how easily he agreed to throw himself into danger. Didn't he just get done telling Cloud he was a target for these people? Zack balled his hands into eager fists and shifted restlessly, ignoring Cloud's kick completely.
"They won't know what hit them." "I know,"
Zhang said over his shoulder, already walking away with Gun trailing at his side.
"Rude, Renault, back him up." "And you got my back too, right, Cloud?"
Zack asked, turning a bright smile on him. Cloud regarded Zack for a quiet moment. The exchange between Zack and Zhang highlighted how their odd friendship worked, though Cloud wasn't sure he appreciated it. The Turks were better off as reluctant allies than friends, unless you were the target of their loyalty. Letting the silence stretch a bit too long, Zack's smile never wavered. He knew Cloud's answer. Cloud finally gave a sharp nod.
"Of course." Renault watched Zhang and Gun walk away melting into the crowd over towards busy Loveless Avenue. They had a little while to wait so that the pair could get into position, and that was just fine with him. Best to outline who was in charge here before anyone started getting funny ideas. Smacking his electromag rod against his palm repeatedly, Renault rounded on his ragtag crew. Not what he'd have hand-picked for an operation like this, but he'd worked with worse. They all stared back at him in various forms. Fair looked downright eager, and Rude was rude. Strife, well, Renault wasn't sure what to expect from Strife anymore. His reactions, his attitude, had ranged the gambit between what Shotgun had reported as his pre-Medeal behaviour and what they'd observed in his post-Medeal attitude. One moment the kid was prowling along like some keen-eyed little guardhound on a scent, and the next he was mouthing off like a brat with a chip on his shoulder the size of Midgar's plate. It made Renault want to smack his mouth off his face and laugh at the same time. Everything about Strife was a contradiction, wrapped in another one. Was he talking bad about Shinra, or did he just think he was more important than he was? Did he have something to prove, or was he just another teenager acting like he did? He was as hard to peel apart as an onion trapped in a bundle of razor weeds. The more time Renault spent around him, the weirder he seemed. But at the same time, Strife blended right on in. It was a bit like trying to pin down a mover. Nasty little bouncy fucks. Strife was a prickly one, that was certain. Full-on defensive, if Renault did say so himself. Maybe he'd have a chat with Shotgun once she got back from the hinterlands. A bit of a sit-down, so they could go over Strife's personality profile a little better. Might be worth a shot, maybe not. For now, though, here's how this is gonna go. He swung his gaze over them once more. All professional air, even if it wasn't reflected in his usual slapdash manner of dress. While Fair looms and stomps around like the heavy-handed butcher he is, the rest of us are gonna toddle down to a nearby street, personally selected for us by our eyes in the sky, though not literally since we don't have a chopper on this gig. Even if it would be helpful, Renault turned his head, shouting that last bit towards Seng's disappearing head. He hoped he heard it, but the boss man didn't twitch an inch, so it was all up in the air. When they say we move, we move. When they say we sit, we twiddle our thumbs. Renault levelled his electromag rod first at Fair, then at Strife. Keep that oversized letter opener pointed in the right direction, and listen to us professionals. Got it? Renault could see Strife's jaw working, and swallowed back the snigger that wanted to escape at his obvious irritation. Strife sent a look at Fair that spoke 1,000 words. I'll have you know, Fair said, giving Renault a straight look. Man, he was either adept at ignoring Strife when he really wanted to, or was just that oblivious. Renault had no idea which. I'm perfectly capable of pulling off infiltration. Yeah, right, Renault shot back without missing a beat. Back me up a little here, Rude. These insubordinate types are really getting a guy down. Rude nodded, just a quick dip of his chin. A good old affirmative. That was just like Rude, backing him up without so much as a vowel or a consonant. Good old Rude. He was the quiet type that Renault could get behind. Not like Strife. Strife was the quiet type that grated just at the edge of his nerves. Like static running through a television program. Nobody liked that kind of noise. A noise that undercut the real important stuff you were listening for. Except maybe, just maybe, Strife was important. Strife as a whole was irritating. Even the way he stood there now. Somehow he looked smug and confident, while half looking like somebody's kicked puppy. Frankly, it made Renault want to rough him up a little. Maybe that was why Sephiroth had decided to take a swing at him, back at Condor. Maybe he just rubbed the hero of Wutai all wrong. Renault wouldn't be surprised. But then, as touchy as Sephiroth seemed to be, he'd say the entire world rubbed him wrong. There was a reason Renault kept far, far away from that business. Even a rat had survival instincts. He wasn't given a chance to follow that line of thought too much further, or stand there staring at Rude and the chumps. His phone rang, just once, before he pulled it out and flipped it open. Renault propped it against his ear and held it there with his shoulder as he flipped his electromag rod between his hands. "Yeah, boss? We're in position. Your first target is a delivery man on Loveless Avenue. He drops off stock at the Goblin Bar every night around this time. And remember, the goal is to apprehend them for questioning." "Right, no slicing and dicing. Just stick 'em to the pavement and douse 'em with enough sleep spell to put 'em out for a while. Got it." Renault hung up before Tseng could say another word, snapped his phone closed, and slipped it into his pocket again. Striding forward, he shoved by between Rude and Strife, taking extra care to shoulder check Strife harder than was strictly necessary. "Boss said we go pick up our new buddy over on Loveless behind the Goblin Bar." Renault only made it 3 steps before a questioning sound had him swinging back round. Fair glanced towards the clock tower archway, separating them from Loveless Avenue. Renault looked over and wondered if Fair expected to see their targets standing there with a neon sign. The only neon sign remained the ones on the walls of the building. Renault turned back to Fair and watched him scuff a hand through his hair. He looked almost nervous. How cute. "That's great and all, but what exactly am I looking for?" Renault reached up and tapped his temples, careful to keep from beaming himself with his electromag rod. "You hear a word I said, man? A delivery guy, out back of the Goblin's Bar. Probably dropping off crates of booze. You go back there enough, it shouldn't be a problem. You're actually the least suspicious to be prowling among the trash cans. Good job." Turning on his heels again, Renault resumed his saunter. "Rude, you take Wonder Boy there and go block off the alley down past Les Maronias, and I'll take care of our little friend when Fair here flushes him out." "What?" Fair yelped. "How do you know about that?" Renault laughed, sharp as his smirk. "Ask Rude." He flicked a glance over his shoulder to see Rude reel back, his mouth parting as Fair turned towards him, and Strife looked on with a face that was both neutral and bemused. It put a whole new skip in his step. Rude, of course, had no idea that Renault had seen Fair down that back alley, chit-chatting with the leader of one of Genesis Rhapsodus's old fan clubs ages ago, and a few times since. Not recently, though. Fair was far too busy with his little blonde shadow for pit stops around Sector 8. That, of course, was interesting in itself. Fair wasn't exactly the type to deprive himself of his social circles. Question is, what does Blondie have Fair leashed with? Or is Fair worried enough about Strife and what Strife's into to stick close as possible? A nearby infantryman on patrol gave him a nod as Renault drifted past, taking a turn that would put him into the alleys and take him towards his destination. No need to let himself be seen near the bar. That might just tip off the target. Renault swung around a corner and prowled past a few dumpsters. Life and light spilled into the shadowy backways from busy Loveless Avenue. He glanced down the spaces between the buildings as he walked, catching glimpses of the avenue's lagging day life. Nothing like it was at night, when it lit up like a goddamn bonfire. Loveless Avenue was always busy, but the throngs of shoppers out in daylight could never compare to the nightlife. Then again, the nightlife of the slums could one-up the nightlife on Loveless easy. Maybe it wasn't as fancy or pretty, and certainly not as clean-cut, but damned if that wasn't part of the charm. He'd have to convince Rude to head down with him after this job was over. Get a drink, hang out, see if any of the other Turks besides Gunn were still in Midgar. His neat shoes tapped against the pavement between a few discarded papers and food containers. Junk that would be cleaned up at the end of the day and tossed off the plate through the waste disposal system if it wasn't incinerated first. This alley led to another, and he circled back towards the Goblin Bar on a winding tangent, looking for all the world like he was on a regular patrol. Turks in Sector 8 weren't unusual, after all. Eventually, he found himself right where he wanted to be, and pulled up against the corner of a building. away from Lovelace Avenue's crowds, but close enough he could hear the loud laughter of some woman up that way. He reclined against the wall and tilted his head, his electromag rod tapping against his shoulder. Waiting, Renault mentally counted down until Strife and Rude should be in position. He swung out, leaning around the corner enough to get a glance down the street, where he thought he caught a glimpse of blonde hair next to the neat line of tailored suits stretched across broad shoulders. Good. Now he just needed to see if he could get a good line of vision on their quarry and the resident bait. Turning to look back up a nearby shady corridor, Renault spied the little truck, the back still full of crates, and half out of his line of sight. He couldn't see fair, or the target, but he didn't expect to. He'd positioned himself where he wouldn't be seen, but would have a chance to intercept. Now it was just about waiting to get this show on the road. Rude and Strife would make sure the target didn't get out onto Lovelace Avenue, and they could get the bastard caught betwixt and between. Besides, he had eyes up above. Saying would give him a signal when he needed to move, and keep him abreast of everyone else's movements. The Turks were a well-oiled machine, and they worked like one, even with a few clunky cogs, just like the two jokers thrown in the mix. Renault let his head loll to the side, and shifted his grip on his electromag rod. The new angle let the metal end of it hit against the brownstone behind him. Tink, tink, clank. It echoed along the quiet side streets. Nothing unusual in Midgar's constant hustle and bustle and noise, but a few thumps, like the sound of a boot or a shoe tapping on the side of a dumpster, echoed back. Renault grinned. All was well on Rude's end, then. Tink, scrape, tock. His response was a quick series of taps, and Renault wondered if he ought to get the big guy some tap shoes with how fast he could manage that. It all really came down to the same thing, though. Rude telling him to knock it off and pay attention. Not like he wasn't. He was just making things more interesting. Tap, 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 thunk. Renault lifted his head. That was a warning from Rude, a heads up. Tink, tink, tink. It was almost game time. Glancing up towards the line of the clock tower arch, he hoped Tseng had a good visual on them. The last thing they needed was for more Shinra property to get wrecked around here. Replacing it would be easy, but man, what a hassle. Extra damage came with extra forms to fill out, and it meant dealing with a public outcry and press conferences. The whole thing gave him a damned headache. Best to cut it off at the pass. Except there was no cutting off anything at the pass. Because the next thing Renault knew, a loud commotion broke out, and then a man ran by with Fair hot on his tail. Right behind him came Rude and Strife. Renault gawked for a second, then exploded in fury. What the hell? He was going to let Tseng have it? Second in command or not, Renault took off after the group at a quick jog, and reached for his phone. Only his phone wasn't in his pocket, and... Swearing, Renault patted at his chest and pants pockets. With an extra spurt of speed, he was able to match paces with Rude and Strife. Up ahead of them, he could see Fair lengthening his stride, then push off to leap up and over their quarry's head. He hit the ground in front of him, spinning neatly and bringing his oversized sword up to cut the spy off. The spy slid to a halt, skipping back a few steps, and held up a hand from which something red sparkled. As the air distorted with strong magic, Renault snarled, "Oh shit!" The street bulged up, splintering and cracking until masonry from nearby buildings started trickling down. Civilians in the area began backing up, or just plain running as massive shoulders shoved their way up, breaking out of the concrete and steel like an egg. It was tempting to throw down his electromag rod and stalk off in disgust. Leave the soldiers to deal with this, since he was positive it was their fault somehow. He was, however, vindictively pleased when all Fair had time to do was shoot the summoned beast a shocked look before he was punched backwards and down the street. He crashed into the storefront across the way, bringing down the overhanging awning in a rain of debris and screams from nearby people. Then Reno had a bit more to worry about, as the summons lifted a slab of the road, and attempted to flatten the rest of them with it. He leapt one way, Rude the other, but Strife, the muscle-headed moron, stood his ground and slashed up with his sword. The impact left Reno's ears ringing, even as the shockwave knocked him hard up against the wall of the alley. Reno coughed as he hit the ground hard, and struggled to catch his breath. Down the street from him, Fair staggered back out of the ruined building, and shook bits of stone and dust from himself. "I'm okay!" "No one asked," Reno hissed, shoving himself back to his feet. He brandished his electromag rod in front of him, swiping at a few fleeing civilians who nearly sent him back to the ground. Where was their target? Strife stood unharmed in the middle of the debris from the attack, clearly geared up to match blows with the summons, and Fair was charging back across to help his little follower, but the one who started all this mess was nowhere in sight, until he heard a loud grunt and saw the spy stagger back down the street. Rude had managed to cut off his escape, and the kick to the spy's stomach neatly prevented him from making a further break for it. Could always count on that guy. "Nice job, partner," Reno called to him as the spy landed. Though it wasn't a neat one, Reno gave him props for not going down under one of Rude's hits. But that was about it. Stepping back out into the rubble-strewn street, Reno leveled his electromag rod at him. "We'll take care of He broke off abruptly, diving for the ground as a massive fist ruffled his hair in its speedy pass. "Can't you morons keep your own fight to yourselves?" "Don't stand so close when you're mouthing off then," Strife retorted, skipping back to avoid another swing. Reno gave him a guttural sound of irritation. It galled him to give the last word in any frame, but he had more important things to do. Scrabbling forward, Reno shoved himself back up and darted towards the spy. He brought his electromag rod swinging down, only for it to clang jarringly against the tonfa the spy had tucked under his arm. A hardened face with grim lines around the mouth and dark eyes stared back at him from behind the man's upraised arm and weapon. Reno grinned and brought a lanky leg up in a sharp kick. The spy knocked his kick aside and ducked back, immediately spinning his tonfa around to take a swipe at Reno. "Hey, Rude!" Reno called as he swayed out of range. "Go give those two idiots some backup. I can handle this guy. We gotta protect company assets." The sound of the summon roaring and putting its fist through another wall in a loud crumbling of masonry punctuated Reno's point nicely. He saw Rude nod out the corner of his eye, hesitate for a long moment, then charge into the fray. Well, Reno didn't really blame him. That summon was a nasty piece of work. Right on cue, he caught sight of a meaty hand grabbing Strife's leg. The summon swung him around and tossed him on up the road. Reno ducked away from another swing from the tonfa and dropped down. His hands hit the street, electromag rod clattering against the cement, as he swept the spy's legs out from under him. The spy's hand shot out, and he propelled himself into a series of neat flips. Reno bounced back up and charged after him. A slip of his finger, and electricity hummed through the weapon. Just the sound of it brought a nasty grin to his face. Let's see how this guy likes tasting colour and seeing sound. He came in low to snake in under the man's guard. A nice zap to the ribs, and he'd be really feeling it. Only the tonfa got swung around again, and pain exploded between Reno's eyes as the spy brought up the short handle to clout him there. Reno staggered back, the charge going out of his electromag rod with a faint whine. On the offensive now, the spy came to him with a series of short, sharp blows interdispersed with powerful kicks. Mouth twisted into a snarl, Reno ducked down, the tonfa whistling close past his head. He came back up, catching the backswing of the electromag rod and forcing it down. His bones vibrated from the force of the tonfa clanging against his weapon. He was forced to continue backpedaling, knocking aside occasional punches thrown towards his face, as he looked for an opening to take advantage of. The spy swung down low, and Reno used the chance to dive right over him. He hit the ground rolling, and spun around as soon as he got his feet under him. Giving his hand a shake, Reno fed a little power into the thunder materia tucked in his wrist bracer. There was something pleasing about watching the spy throw himself around to avoid the streams of electricity Renault threw at him. Vengeance for the nasty headache he could feel coming on already. Renault gave chase, sliding the switch to charge the weapon again. This time, he brought it down against the man's back with a satisfyingly meaty sound, followed by the crackle snap of discharging electricity. The spy went down with a yell, his body twisting in a few short spasms. With a satisfied smirk, Renault gave the downed man a sharp nudge in the ribs with the toe of his shoe, then turned away. Now that was taken care of. He watched Fair skid down the road as he caught a massive fist against the flat of his sword. He almost went far enough back to fall into the sparking electrical pit, where part of the road had been and the underlying plate was laid bare. Damn, they were going to have to check for Marco leaks now. Son of a bitch. Only there was a problem. "Hey," he said. "Why isn't the summoner The words turned into a garbled yell of pain and surprise as the flat of a tonfa slammed into the small of his back, and Renault sprawled forward. A weight came down on him, the sharp feel of a knee pressed into the middle of his back, and the hard metal of the tonfa looped around his neck and yanked back. Renault gagged and attempted to elbow the spy off, but the position was too awkward to get a clear shot. A slew of swear words ran through his mind like wildfire, as spots began dancing around the edges of his vision. A haze was slowly creeping up his mind, making it seem like everything was slowing down as he lost the ability to breathe. It was then that Renault spotted the woman. She stood a ways up the road and had one of those Wutai halberd gun hybrid weapons aimed right at Fair's back. Fair, who was too busy holding back the summon, sword to fists, unable to move lest the beast get an opening to smash the soldier. Rude was running towards Renault and his attacker. "Faster, partner," unaware of the new danger, and Renault had no breath to shout a warning. All he could do was claw at the tonfa and the cement in a futile effort to get more air. The next few jumbled seconds proved that a warning was unnecessary. Before the woman could fire, Strife came flying in out of nowhere, snapping the weapon in half with a smashing blow. Strife didn't have his sword on him, but it didn't slow him down as he shot out a hand, hoisting the woman aloft in a chokehold. Negligently, effortlessly, he tossed her high into the air, leaping after and coming down on her still rising body with a fierce kick that sent her hurtling to the street. Her body made a new crater in the ravaged road, and a moment later Strife landed astride her, one fist raised as if he would smash her face in. All that took only the few seconds it took Rude to arrive to Renault's aid and haul the spy up by his collar before shoving him away. Renault immediately rolled over onto his back, gasping in air and fumbling in his pocket for the new, experimental materia he kept on hand. They'd told him it was good for containment, so he might as well test it now. It took a thought, a quick shove of power to make the thing flare, and Renault gestured towards the spy. Sparks of light leapt the distance between them before a golden, gleaming pyramid bloomed around the spy. The spy brought his tonfa up and rapped it against one of the three walls to no avail. Renault slowly pushed himself up, watching as the pyramid flickered slightly, like a candle in a breeze. He'd have to keep an eye on it. No telling what a piece of experimental materia was capable of, or if it'd fail. Once he was upright, he held himself still. The air around Strife shimmered and wavered sickeningly about his unmoving form, still poised to strike the woman where she lay. Even from here, Renault could see her trembling and staring wide-eyed back. It was just as hair-raising to look at Strife right then, as it was to come within sneezing distance of Sephiroth. The tableau put a whole new weight on the quiet grumbles that Strife had trashed the soldier training room. "Hey, buddy, deep breaths." Fair's voice shattered the odd silence that had settled, though the sound of more cracking concrete and masonry broke it further. Fair jumped back, landing a few feet from the crater Strife had created, half-crouched. "You want me to join you, or should I finish the big guy?" "Soldiers." Renault rolled his eyes, shaking off his creeps. If you two would get a move on? His voice came out raspy and thick, his throat aching. Yeah, Fair called back. I'm on it. With a shove that looked effortless, Fair kicked off and rushed the summon again. He manoeuvred his oversized sword through a chain of quick slashes that sent it staggering back. Renault had to wonder if he could have done that from the get-go. The final swing sent the summons stumbling drunkenly into one of the destroyed buildings as it began to fade away. There was a soft thump that made Renault turn his head to see Strife dragging his catch over by Rude, where he dropped her roughly to the ground before he crossed his arms and glowered at nothing. For her part, the woman didn't move from where she sprawled, though Renault wasn't sure if it was because she couldn't move or knew better than to try. Renault just stood there, watching the dust settle as Fair wandered over towards them, his sword on his back again. When he came level, Renault noted Strife's shoulders relaxed somewhat, and his face softened into its normal blank expression. The kid was really high-strung under his calm facade. Renault wondered if Strife's loyalty to Fair would cause problems down the road. Fair gave Strife a once-over, from scuffed boots to the tips of his spiky blonde hair. Everything settled? For his part, Strife gave a half shrug with one shoulder, but nodded. Sorry. Renault tried not to scoff out loud. Sorry? What did that even mean? Sorry for nearly smashing one of their targets' faces in? Sorry for letting the summon rampage around, destroying the street? Sorry for being such a toolbag? Fair propped his hands on his hips and gave Strife another look over, a half smile sliding into place. Where's your sword? Strife blinked, made an abortive gesture at one's shoulder, before looking up the street with what might have been a sheepish look on a slab of concrete. In fact, Renault would go as far as to say the concrete around them had much more personality. This is lovely and all, but any of you want to cast a sleep spell on these two? Renault groused, gesturing towards the two spies. The golden barrier around the man flickered again. Strife looked over his shoulder at the captured spy, then half turned to get a better look at the glittering pyramid. Well, it certainly wasn't like any spell he'd seen before, or at least it shouldn't be, but Renault was starting to take nothing for granted when it came to Strife. At least Rude was on the ball, Renault noticed, watching him step over and brandish his bracer. A cast later, and the woman was out like a light. The quick staccato sound of approaching footsteps had Renault looking around the other way. Tseng, with gun trailing behind him, came trotting up the road to join them. About time, boss, Renault complained, and Tseng proceeded to ignore him. The woman may have contacted their other accomplices. Zack, Cloud, I need you two to head down to the slums. I've sent the information to your phone. He nodded at Zack, then turned to gesture Rude over. Once we disable this one, we need to make for Sector 0. No problem, Tseng, Fair said, waving at Strife. Let's go get your sword and get moving. One moment before you go. Tseng turned as Renault let go of the spell, and Rude tossed another sleep spell. Cloud, Renault's phone. What? Renault bristled, rounding on Strife. You little... Only to get a face full of phone as the device was tossed right at his head. He fumbled it, glaring at Strife's back, and tightening his grip until he heard plastic creak. We don't have time for this. Tseng's cool voice drove through the sharp thoughts of violence curling in Renault's abdomen. Spitting on the cracked cement, Renault turned away. Yeah, whatever. Let's go. He'd deal with Strife later. It didn't take them long to find Cloud's sword. Then they were heading off towards Sector 1's train station. Zack didn't let them get far before he grabbed Cloud by the elbow and yanked him down a nearby alley. He wasn't exactly gentle when he shoved him up against one of the walls. Then again, Cloud was a tough guy. He could take a little rough handling. Zack crossed his arms over his chest and gave him a hard look, mouth in a firm line. What was that, Cloud? He had no idea what was driving Cloud to act so erratically. He'd been fine before they ran in with the Turks. Cloud turned his head away with a scowl, crossing his arms in front of him. Classic defensive position. "We have a mission to finish," he said, shoving off the wall and trying to move past Zack. Zack shot a hand out and grabbed him again, slamming him back into the wall a little harder. This time, he kept a firm grip on Cloud's shoulder to keep him in place. Cloud glared up at him, Mako eyes glittering in the dim light. "The mission can wait," Zack said, giving Cloud a pointed look. "We need to talk about you jeopardizing our other mission." "I'm not!" "Yeah, you are. And all to get one up on a Turk? What the hell, Cloud?" It was eerie how easily Cloud could seem like he didn't care. How easily he could close it all away. Just like Sephiroth did. Right then, Zack wanted nothing more than to be as adept as Angeal had been at giving a right old lecture. Maybe he could start getting something to penetrate their thick skulls. Then again, if Angeal hadn't succeeded in getting through to Sephiroth, Zack had no idea if he could. Maybe he should just start punching them. It was a tempting idea right now. Cloud grit his teeth and wouldn't meet Zack's eyes. "I really don't like this, Reno." Zack sighed and let his grip up again. Let himself ease back. His expression remained serious as he glanced back out of the alley at the street beyond. No one was there, everyone still too spooked by the summon that had appeared a few blocks down. "We've talked about this." His hand clenched into a fist, leather creaking. "I'm not talking about that," Cloud hissed slowly. "I liked my Reno more than that guy." He waved a hand back the way they came. Zack's gaze snapped back to Cloud, and he grimaced. It was often hard to deal with the nature of Cloud's predicament. It wasn't like anyone had ever given Zack a handbook on what to do with a time-traveling friend. The way Cloud said it made Zack's aggravation deflate further, and he leaned back against the wall opposite Cloud. "Look, I know this is hard and Reno's irritating, but they're Turks, and this is Shinra. You can't pull stunts like this." Cloud frowned flatly at him. "I could. There are other ways." He shook his head, though, and recrossed his arms. "I know." He trailed off, eyes flicking from the mouth of the alley to Zack's face and back restlessly. "I shouldn't have, I know." "No," Zack said sharply. "You shouldn't have." Now he was going to have to report Cloud's behavior to Lazard. And there was no doubt that the Turks would be doing the same. What a mess. If he was lucky, they wouldn't get too much of a reprimand. Cloud hadn't been much trouble, honestly. Just the training room and this. Zack had caused more damage in his years in Shinra, really. "We don't need Turk attention, not to mention the amount of damage this caused." He realized as soon as he said it that Cloud was probably going to get that pinched, guilty look on his face. Zack felt bad, but at the same time, a part of him hoped it would drive home his point a little. Cloud and emotional control were definitely proving to be an issue. Sure enough, Cloud's face scrunched up as he ducked his chin into his scarf. I didn't see. Did anyone get hurt?" "I don't think so," Zack said, glad he could alleviate at least that much. "Though I think a chunk of Sector 8 might have lost power." He glanced up at the lack of light beneath the dim underbelly of clouds. At least it was early in the day, so there wasn't an issue of people sitting in the dark. But still! Incongruously, Cloud grinned at that. Limits dinner to the cafeteria, doesn't it? Zack stared for a long, long moment. He tried to find words, tried to think of some reply to that, but nothing came. He should continue this conversation, to drill the importance of what he was saying into Cloud's head. But weakly he said, "We should go see if the trains are still running." Cloud gave him a slightly baffled look, as if he wasn't aware his mood had shifted faster than a grandhorn on ice, but nodded in agreement. Zack gave him another look, then turned and headed off. He waved Cloud after him as he pulled his phone out and flipped it open. Thumbing over to the message Thing had sent him, he offered, This says we're looking for someone impersonating a Shinra trooper around Sector 5 slums. And one other. Though the details on the last are vague. Someone hanging around the park. His humour returning to him, Zack shot Cloud a look. You sure we aren't looking for you? With a few quick steps to catch up to Zack's long stride, Cloud frowned at him in true puzzlement this time. What? Always hanging around Sector 5 and the park, wearing a Shinra trooper uniform, impersonating a law-abiding member of the Shinra force? I dunno, sounds like you to me. Zack snapped his phone closed and pocketed it again as they turned the corner, heading for the train station. This wasn't his usual route, which cut through Fountain Square, but they were making good time. Hopefully they hadn't missed the most recent train. I can't be in two places at once, though, Cloud pointed out reasonably, a smile tugging at his face. So the other one must be you. Don't know why they don't have any details. They rounded the last corner, and ahead of them the train was just beginning to pull out of the station. I am a master of espionage. Over the sound of the train whistle blowing its departure, Zack heard the rare, clear sound of Cloud's laughter. Lengthening his stride, Zack made a dash for the last car on the train, leaping onto it easily. He wrapped his arms around the metal rail nearby and leaned out, extending his hand to give Cloud a hand aboard. Cloud's boot left the edge of the platform just in time, his hand clasping Zack's firmly. Zack used his momentum to toss Cloud up to the top of the train car, since the caboose didn't have an end door for them to slip in through. A moment later, Cloud gave his arm a tug, and Zack released his hold to let himself be pulled up as well. A wind whipped through their hair as the train increased in speed, heading towards the tunnel that would carry them down under the plate. For a moment, Zack crouched beside Cloud. It reminded him of the last training session with Angeal, and he could feel his throat constricting at the thought. That day, Angeal had told him who'd recommended him for first, and then disappeared. What had started as a routine day in the training room fighting simulated Wutai insurgents, disguised as Shinra infantry, couldn't have gone more wrong. He shot a glance at Cloud, who still looked amused. At least it hasn't ended up all bad. Irritating as Cloud could be, he was still a great friend to have around. Waving for Zack to follow, Cloud rose to a crouch and carefully walked his way up the train. He paused for a moment at the dividing space between cars before leaping across it easily. The tunnel was fast approaching, and they needed to get inside before then. A little further, and Cloud suddenly stopped, flattening himself on the roof of the car as he leaned precariously over the side of the train. He ran his hands across the edge of the train before finding a grip he liked, then shot Zack a grin as he flipped forward and down. Shaking his head, Zack rose into his own crouch and followed after, though his pace was a little quicker. He stopped at the same point Cloud had and eased his legs down over the edge. Gripping the top of the train car, Zack let himself drop until his arms were fully extended. Zack let go with one hand and swung into the car to land lightly behind Cloud. Faced with the shocked stares of passengers, Zack lifted his hand in a short wave, just as the tunnel closed around them and the world outside disappeared. Zack reached forward and jabbed Cloud in the back around his longsword. Go find somewhere to sit. Cloud glanced over his shoulder, quirking an eye at the command, but gamely made his way down the train car. This one was fairly crowded, so they went through the dividing doors, down to the next one. Zack trailed behind. There were more seats in that car, and Cloud stripped off his sword to flop down in the nearest available pair. Zack followed suit and pulled Buster's sword off before twisting around and plunking onto the seat next to Cloud. This, of course, left Buster's sword to span across the aisle, blocking it no matter how low he let it dangle. Trains really weren't built for weapons of this kind. Zack frowned down at it, absently reaching out to slide a gloved hand over the flat. Cloud leaned forward to watch Zack fuss over the blade, then quietly said, "You used it." "Yeah," Zack murmured, just as quiet. "It was the fastest way." He thought Angier would have approved a little bit. It had been to make sure no one got hurt. He probably should have taken care of it sooner, but he hadn't expected Cloud to be knocked half the sector away either. "I'll clean it up when we get back home." Besides, hadn't he sworn to himself that if he felt the need to use the blade, he would? No going back on that. Zack glanced up as the train's conductor stepped awkwardly over Buster's sword. He gave the sword a weary look, then nodded amiably to both of them before continuing on his way. Poor guy, he's getting used to this. Zack smiled and ran a hand along Buster Sword's blunt edge as he settled into his seat. When the train stopped in Sector 7 station, Zack was up immediately. He swung Buster Sword onto his back and barreled towards the door. The few people who'd remained in the car after their entrance stepped aside quickly to let him pass, one going so far as to dive back into his seat to avoid having his shins hit by Buster Sword. Cloud followed at a more sedate pace. Zack swung out of the train, boots landing solidly on the platform. He waited a moment for Cloud to join him before loping off towards Sector 5. "Game plan?" Zack asked. "Well, other than trying not to trash the place. It wasn't my fault this time," Cloud muttered, just loud enough for Zack to make out over the ambient noise of the crowd. "You made good bait last time," he added, louder. "Maybe you should be bait this time," Zack called back, weaving around a group of teenagers and lengthening his stride. He could hear a few calling insults after them, though it barely registered. The Sector 6 park wasn't far from the train station, almost like a buffer between Sector 7 and 5. It made the journey quick, at least. Rounding the last bend, Cloud said, "Actually, I don't think we need bait." Zack glanced forward, saw the flash of a rifle arcing towards them, and dove out of the way just in time to avoid the spray of bullets. He could see Cloud pulling out of his own neat tumble across the way. "Convenient," Zack said brightly. He reached up to catch hold of Buster Sword's hilt. On the other side of the park, the apparent trooper reached up, yanking his helmet off, and tossed it to the ground. It rolled a few feet to settle in the dust as the rifle leveled on Zack again. Zack met the man's grim gaze and smiled. He stood up, dust swirling around his boots, and lifted Buster Sword from his back. "Cloud, you go that way and make sure he doesn't get away." He saw Cloud nod out of the corner of his eye, then crouch and make a flying leap up and over the playground. He landed with his sword out and at the ready, blocking off any possible retreat into the crowded wall market. Zack charged forward, leaping over another spray of bullets that pitted the dirt below him. The man rolled out of the way as Zack landed. Zack spun the Buster Sword around as their target tossed his rifle at him, and brought the blade up to cut it in two before charging in again. Another swing, and the man stumbled back, kicking out wildly. He was desperate, and Zack could feel it as surely as he caught the kick on his forearm. He shoved, sending the man into the dirt on his back. Too easy. Lowering Buster Sword, he was here to capture, not kill after all. Zack stepped forward. "Just stay down, man," he said. "You have a sleep material on you, Cloud?" If he didn't, they'd just have to knock him out the old-fashioned way. Instead of answering, Cloud let out a sharp warning just in time for a small body to come hurtling out of one of the play structures. A whirlwind of tiny fists, interdispersed with cries of, "Stop it! Stop it! Stop it!" hit his side. Zack released one hand from Buster Sword's hilt and twisted around to grab both of his small attacker's wrists in a strong grip. Pulling, he hauled the kid forward and stared down at him in bemusement. He couldn't be more than 9 years old. "Hey, come on, kid, knock it off." In fact, Zack thought he recognized him from around Sector 5 slums. Had he seen him playing with the other kids here at the park before? Remembering the bigger threat, Zack turned his attention back to the spy, while the kid tried to yank free of his grasp futilely. He needn't have worried, as Cloud had stepped forward, while his focus was elsewhere, and now had his sword at the man's throat, effectively keeping him immobile. I told you to stay hidden, the man rasped, his eyes darting back and forth between Zack and Cloud. But they were going to kill you, the kid wailed, still trying to land a kick on Zack's side as he struggled. Whoa, slow down. What's going on here? Zack asked, ignoring the feeling of a booted foot against his shin. Cloud did that all the time anyway. He waved his hand at Cloud. Give me some breathing room. Cloud raised an eyebrow at him, clearly asking if that was a good idea, but stepped back obediently. The spy rolled over and immediately spat on Zack's boot, which he ignored with a bland smile. Just finish me, Shinra scum. Leave me with a little honor. There's no honor in sacrificing yourself if you won't be there to protect your kid, Cloud said, voice tight with some emotion Zack couldn't identify. Zack looked over at him, mouth thinning with worry. Cloud had been acting pretty unstable today. Maybe he needed a break. He'd have to worry about it later. For now, Zack shifted and let Buster Sword's edge touch the ground as he lowered himself to rest on one knee. Look, kid, no one's getting killed, okay? Near face to face with the kid now, Zack could definitely see the familial resemblance. He had his dad's grim stare. Cloud's right. Someone's got to be around to keep an eye on you. Now, if I let you go, are you going to stop trying to kick my ass? What was it with Wutai kids anyway? Sheesh. It's like they didn't know the meaning of danger. First there was that kid at Fort Tamlin, who'd started sending him those crazy messages, and now this. It brought to mind that man from the Crescent unit he'd let go back then too. Looking up at the plate, Zack only needed to give it a few seconds of thought. The rest of your bodies have already been rounded up. That wasn't necessarily true, but it may as well be. There was no way Tseng and the rest of the Turks would let the other 3 targets get away. You should take your kid and get out of Midgar while the going's good. If you leave me alive, the man gritted out, nothing will stop me from continuing to work against you and Shinra. Yeah, Zack said, waving the man away. You'll be after my head for the rest of your life. I know how it works. I'll see you when you come to collect. He let go of the kid, who immediately scrambled away from him, and straightened back up. Idly, Zack dusted his pants off. If you hurry, you might be able to make it well out of the city, and find somewhere to hide there for the night. As the man climbed warily to his feet, Zack looked over towards Cloud and watched him glower. Looks like our job here is done. I didn't find any spies down here, did you, Cloud? They must have escaped before we arrived. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see the man backing away, his son in tow. Cloud's gaze followed them as they disappeared down the road towards Wall Market, and there was something indefinably sad in his expression. Zack opened his mouth to ask if he was all right, only for a soft voice to speak up from behind them. You're just a big softy, aren't you, Zack? Zack stiffened. It was comical how fast that made Cloud all but levitate into the air, whirling to land with his sword at the ready for more combat. Zack turned around more slowly, shoulders tense, and gave a smile that was more of a grimace. For her part, Cissnei didn't even flinch at Cloud's sudden aggressive stance. She just crossed her arms and smiled at the two of them in that way of hers. Hey, Cissnei, you saw all of that, huh? Zack rubbed at the back of his neck. This could be a problem. Reaching over, Zack pressed 2 fingers to the flat of Cloud's longsword and pushed down on it. Enough, Cissnei said, her gaze slipping over to Cloud. I'm glad you're doing better than last time we met. Cloud gave her a long, long look before he slid his sword away. Zack has helped me, he replied quietly. It made Zack wonder if he even remembered Cissnei at all. Cloud had been disorientated at the time, thanks to his unorthodox arrival. Cissnei's gaze flicked between the two of them again, though her smile never wavered. Everyone's heard all about Soldier First Class Zack Fair and his pupil. Shinra's full of more gossips than employees, Zack grumbled. What are you doing down here, Cissnei? I'm off duty, she said with a bland shrug, and that could mean any number of things. Zack well knew that much. Was she telling the truth, or covering up the fact that she was here watching Aerith? or watching them. Huh. Well, Cloud and I should probably report in. How was he going to deal with this? He had no idea what to do in the face of Cisne's level stare and calm, conversational words. Cisne turned and took a few steps away. Tseng's probably waiting. She glanced back and lifted a hand in a brief wave. Don't worry, I won't tell. See you around, Zack. Yeah, see you. Zack sucked in a deep breath and let it out in a rush as he stared after her retreating back. Dealing with Cisne lately was a strange affair. He still wasn't sure if he could trust her, but he suspected that right now, he was going to have to. Zack turned and finally put Buster Sword away. Let's go, Cloud. We should head back up. The only good way to fill out reports was over food, in Renault's not-so-humble opinion. He sat, one hand wielding a pen and the other holding an ice pack against his forehead, his suit coat off and nicely hanging on the back of his chair. His electromag rod and goggles were scattered over the table among the array of plastic containers full of half-eaten food. Rather than commandeering the briefing room on the soldier floor or the Turks' control room, Tseng had brought them to the executive cafeteria. Most of the soldiers were giving them a wide enough berth for now, though there was a decent scattering of them lounging around the room. Renault wondered if they were just trying to skive off work. Strife had the good sense to sit clear across the table from him, putting Tseng and Rude between them on one side, and Gun and Fair on the other. Signing off on this mission was turning out to be more of a headache than he'd imagined. A written report, signed and filed to the proper places on top of the digital system. You know, if someone hadn't screwed us over and let the first one get off a summon, we wouldn't be here right now, he said snidely. Strife glowered at him, opening his mouth, and then winced before turning that hot stare on Fair. Renault suspected he'd just been kicked under the table. Good. The little brat deserved it. Strife's gaze dropped down to the papers in front of him. He looked like they were about to rear up and bite him, or like he wanted to introduce them to his sword. Renault could sympathize on that, at least. As he watched, Strife leaned closer to Fair, very obviously stealing a look at the report Fair was working on. Renault snorted. Strife seemed to be as subtle as blunt force trauma, which made no sense with the mystery he presented. Irritated, Renault flung his pen down and sat back in his chair. No one even looked his way. Renault reached for his stir-fry and set his ice pack aside. He'd just taken a big mouthful when Strife said, "You do know that's not how you spelled Tseng's name, right?" Renault choked, food going down all wrong or trying to escape as he spluttered. Did Strife do that on purpose? It didn't stop him from shooting a glance at Tseng, who looked up at the sound of his name. Tseng's name wasn't exactly common, particularly not around Shinra or Midgar, and he doubted it could be out in the boonies where Strife apparently came from. The pronunciation and spelling were about as far apart as they could get. Renault studied Tseng's profile, but the small frown tugging at his mouth told him enough. Tseng was as surprised by this as Renault was. Fair, however. Fair looked at Strife, then over at Tseng, then looked confused and betrayed. "I've been spelling your name wrong this entire time, and you never told me?" he asked plaintively. Tseng's expression shifted into a faint smile, and he turned back to his own papers. "No." "Tseng!" Fair cried, rocking back in his chair. "How could you?" "By fixing the errors in your report before turning them in." Oh, but Renault recognized that tone. That tone meant Tseng had been so amused by it that he'd let it go. Sadistic fuck. And here people accused Renault of having a nasty sense of humour. Just then Renault's phone beeped, along with several others in various parts of the cafeteria. Renault pulled out his phone. Fair mirrored the move across the table. He could see a number of soldiers doing the same thing out of the corner of his eye. Flipping his phone open, he thumbed over to the mail. Fan club news. The Silver Elite were at it again. Blinking, Renault looked up and eyed Fair as the first started laughing. Couldn't be. Oh man, how do they get this info? Fair nudged Strife with his elbow, and they started reading. We all know that Sephiroth is extremely fit, but what do we know about how he retains that physique of his? I'm sure some of you have heard the news that Sephiroth likes to train topless. We can't help but think this speaks highly of his skills, that he would go into a training battle without something between him and danger. We also wonder how he keeps his skin that smooth. There was a small, but loud crack as Strife snapped the penny held in half. What's the matter? Renault drawled. Jealous? He could definitely hear more plastic crunching, and the look Strife gave him, right then, could have qualified as a deadly weapon. No worries. Pretty much everyone who comes to Shinra wants to be him, be like him, or be with him. Renault. Rude and Seng said in perfect unison, their exasperation filling every bit of the 2 syllables. Renault grinned, even if there was a part of him that wanted to crawl right out of his skin from having that cold, soldier-type stare on him. Renault let his grin take on a razor edge. Even if he couldn't quite get a bead on Strife, he could poke holes in that stalwart exterior. He could find the little things that niggled at him, that crawled under his skin. He could find ways to use them, to break him open and figure out that damned mystery eventually. Renault was good at that. Did you try on that coat as well as cuddle with it? Strife stood abruptly, turned, and stalked towards the door. Aw, come on, Cloud, Fair called after him, nearly tipping his chair over as he leaned back. No, Zack, Strife shot back, practically growling. Fair shoved himself up fast enough to topple his chair and grabbed up his and Strife's collective papers before following after his wayward charge. Once they were gone, Renault opened his mouth, and Seng immediately cut him off. Don't start, Renault. Sheesh, everyone's touchy. Renault plucked his ice pack back up and placed it against his aching forehead. I was just gonna say that every damn thing he does goes against what we know. Seng gave a low that suggested he didn't quite believe him, but sat his pen down regardless. He sent a shuddered look at the soldiers in the room around them. We'll discuss this later. It wasn't what Renault wanted to hear, even if he knew the truth of it. There was no getting around the fact that they didn't have the privacy to talk about it here, or the time. Their investigation into Strife wasn't top priority, even if it was important. They had priorities. The mutterings of hotheads in Wutai took precedence. Avalanche took precedence. There was a long list of things that took precedence over Strife, from watching the Ancient and Fair, to making sure that whatever new and nasty thing Hojo was up to was kept under wraps, to keeping an ear on internal politics, and who was backstabbing who, and who might go against the company. The thing was, Renault was certain Strife presented a very real problem. Strife was an anomaly, an oddity. He was something in the sleek design of Shinra that didn't make sense, and that wasn't a good thing. He didn't fall in line with the rest of the drones, just like Fair didn't, and just like Sephiroth didn't, just like Genesis Rhapsodus and Angeal Hewley hadn't, and look where that got them. A heap of trouble and secrets that threatened to leak out. It was no good, and Renault was certain that for as cow-eyed as Strife seemed most of the time, Strife was no good. He was probably on the verge of being an obsession, but it was one that mixed so well with the rest of Renault's obsessions that it probably didn't matter. First and foremost, Renault was a Turk before anything else. He lived and breathed information and subterfuge, and all of it was drowned in the smell of steel and Marco, the smell of power. If it were up to Renault, he'd have Strife in a gutter today. That was the thing, though. Shinra liked power, and he was damn certain that the president was already keeping an eye on Strife's rising star. Seng had reported to Veld after the Condor incident. Renault had been there, and Veld was duty-bound to report to the president. In the end, while their official-unofficial investigation went on, their hands were tied. No matter what Renault's personal thoughts on Strife were, he couldn't do anything about them. That's just what it was too. His personal feelings on the matter. Renault had learned long ago to divorce personal feelings from business, but this was becoming complicated. The issue was that Renault didn't like the statistical anomaly that strife represented. There were too many things that didn't add up, and not enough that did. There was a vacuum of solid evidence, and nothing to go off of. He didn't like that no matter where he poked his nose, he was turning up bare bones. And a whole shitload of nothing. He didn't like that was more suspicious than it wasn't. Strife had crawled out of a mako pool one day and flipped the entire world upside down within 3 months. The Shinra machine was efficient, timed, well-oiled, and Renault didn't appreciate that Strife represented a hitch in the mechanism. Most of all, he didn't like that Strife got under his skin without even trying. Tseng sighed and looked towards the clock on the wall, then stood. I have to get going. I am late for my shift anyway. Tseng nodded to Gun and began gathering his things. Renault shoved himself to his feet. I'm out too, he said, grabbing his suit coat off the back of his chair. He slung it over one shoulder. Tseng didn't wait as Renault grabbed his papers, rolled them up and shoved them in a back pocket so that he could snag his goggles, trash and electromag rod, which he slung through a loop in his belt negligently. He hadn't expected him to, and by the time Renault reached the elevator, it had already borne Tseng away. Renault jabbed the button with more viciousness than was strictly necessary, and waited. Behind him he heard Rude's low rumble as he spoke, presumably saying something to Gun, since she replied a moment later. No, it's fine. I'm about done here myself. He lost anything else that may have been said as he stepped into the elevator. Renault hit the button for the entrance and slouched back in the corner with boneless grace. Just as the doors were about to close, Rude's arm snaked out to stop them. Rude followed his arm through and took up space in the middle of the car. Renault's stomach gave that familiar, funny little swoop as the elevator began its descent. He stared at the side of Rude's head for a few moments before turning his gaze back to the ceiling and the bright lights there. Thanks, he drawled, elongating the word far more than necessary. Tseng often remarked at his ability to mangle any language he spoke. You know, for earlier. Rude adjusted his glasses in that way that said he was a bit uncomfortable with the gratitude, but still appreciated it all the same. You look like you needed a hand. Renault laughed, sharp and rasping. Damn, but his throat hurt. I could have handled it. He just managed to get the drop on me because of all the ruckus you and the Sword Brigade were picking up. Rude shrugged, and that movement alone was a wealth of information. It said, maybe you could, maybe you couldn't. But it also said, doesn't matter, I helped anyway. It was the kind of, what can you do, shrug that Renault couldn't pull off in a million years. The silence also invited further conversation, and even if it didn't, Renault hardly cared. I don't like him, he said. His ice pack had reached the point where it was melted enough to start forming condensation. Cool little droplets slid down Renault's forehead and wet the hair at his temples. He turned his arm and wiped it away with his shirt cuff and the back of his thin wrist. Rude's response was predictable, bland, but with a wealth of dry humour buried underneath his straight-faced tone. I noticed. The numbers were counting down, and they'd reach the bottom floor of the building soon. It makes you wonder, Renault said, idly, what fare season him. Did he just want a charity case, or is there something more going on there? For all Renault's enjoyment and gossip about love lives and frivolity, it was just that, a bit of fun, generally speaking. He wasn't stupid enough to think Strife had that scandalous a personal life. For one, the kid had all the personality of an unpainted wall. But gossip was fun, and more than that, gossip was a people's lifeblood. While everyone twittered over the latest silly piece of news, the real shit flew under the radar. Besides, Shinra's rumour mill was notoriously prone to ridiculousness, and everyone knew it. That's what we're trying to figure out. Renault tilted his eyes back towards Rude and swung away from the wall. Yeah, but maybe we should be doing a little more snooping on our own. Shotgun's off in that backwater hick town, and Cisne's got the job tailing Fair and Strife while they play house. What have we got kicking around other than doing a little paper pushing? The director and Singh are on top of things, Rude said carefully, logically. His head turned to glance at Renault as he paused. But it wouldn't hurt. With a little ding, the doors hissed open, and Renault headed for them with a grin. Good old Rude. Come on, partner, I need a drink. After today, he damn well deserved a whole liquor cabinet. Slums? Rude asked, his quiet steps following Renault as he made his way past the tables and towards the stairs. Fuck yes! I refuse to go near Loveless Avenue for at least a business week. His shit mood still lingered at the back of his throat, raw and sour. Renault still couldn't shake the bad feeling vibe, but at least palling around with Rude and getting a few drinks in promised an upswing. You sure? Positive.
The awe-inspiring view of the Mako reactors stretched out below Cloud from where he was perched on top of the Shinra Tower. Whether you thought it terrible or great, you couldn't deny that Shinra was adept at making an unforgettable statement. The wind tugged at his hair and clothes, futilely trying to dislodge him from his precarious perch at the edge of the roof. He paid it no mind. In one hand, he loosely clasped the neck of a bottle of wine, the cork long lost to the drop. It was almost the perfect place for privacy. No one would brave the president's office just to climb up here. Cloud had taken the longer, more hazardous route of climbing the outside of the building from one of the lower floors. Unless someone took that route. But no one would. Cloud had already shaken off Zack with curt words and his black mood. Sorry, Zack. Right now, he didn't want to see anyone. No, that wasn't true. He didn't want to see anyone from this time. Not Zack, not Aerith, and certainly not Renault, who had been the catalyst to the downslide his mood had taken. He wanted Tifa. He wanted Denzel and Marlene, and his family and friends. He wanted to be back in that future he'd fought so hard for, had lost so much to shape. A future where people knew who he was, knew what he'd been through, who had been through it with him. Aerith had told him that it was okay to let go, to accept this second chance, in her roundabout, yet somehow still all-knowing way. And he had been. Seeing Zack and her alive and well had been slowly healing a wound in his heart. Discovering the man behind the legend that had been Shinra's greatest warrior, separating the Sephiroth of now from the insane force that haunted his nightmares. It had changed something within him that he was still coming to grips with. The way Cloud viewed things had fundamentally changed. And then Renault had waltzed into the picture, disrupting the delicate status quo Cloud had achieved, and reminded him of everything he'd lost. In the future that now wasn't, Cloud had harbored an active dislike for Renault. The man had been instrumental in the destruction of an entire sector, had been responsible for Denzel's orphan status, had hounded Cloud and his friends so many times that the antagonism was well justified, despite the things Renault had done for the betterment of the people. Then, somewhere in there, Renault had matured, grown into a more somber man. He still grated on the nerves, was still loyal to the wrong people, but he had gained humanity along the way. When the world was in danger, when Cloud had better things to worry about than another scuffle with the Turks, Renault had stepped aside, recognizing that there were greater things at stake. He'd been a leading force in the evacuation of Midgar's people when Meteor had fallen. And when Edge had sprung up, the Turks had been there, helping to restore life to a semblance of normality. They had performed much of the dirty work that Cloud couldn't bring himself to do, that still needed to be done. The man he'd met today had none of that. Full of his own self-importance, high on Shinra's unmatched success, this Reno hadn't been tempered by world-threatening trials, hadn't had his eyes open to the larger issues of the world outside of Shinra's influence. He hadn't faced death beyond what a normal man could bring, hadn't had to make choices that he regretted. It was that attitude, above all else, that had set Cloud's nerves on fire. It almost made him realize that if things went the way Zack and he intended, Reno would never become that man. For a while now, Cloud had been walking among ghosts. That had made it easy, once it had been brought to his attention, to separate the people from his old life from these new friends. He'd spent so much time with Zack and Aerith, had built so many strong memories that shone brightly in comparison to the softer, faded glimpses of past friends. Just as beloved, but markedly different. Then there was Reno, and everything he wasn't. Reno, who had been a reluctant constant in Cloud's life over the past few years, who Cloud knew with the intimacy of necessity, someone who Cloud had seen only in passing a few times since his arrival, but hadn't interacted with. The differences had been stark, startling, and Cloud had stumbled badly as ingrained reactions had flooded to the surface. The burning knowledge that this wasn't the man he'd known for so long clawed at the back of his mind in a way it hadn't with Zack and Aerith. Zack and Aerith had come back, but Reno was gone, and it was suddenly hitting home that his friends, his family, were as well. Cloud's grip tightened convulsively on the bottle, but otherwise he didn't move. This was worse than having to face old ghosts. His family wasn't just dead. They were lost. Lost forever to him, without him ever having a choice. A chance to protest. A chance to say goodbye. What with the distraction of reconnecting with Zack and Aerith, of the hopeful enigma Sephiroth was presenting, it hadn't quite struck Cloud that he'd never see them again. He'd known, but he hadn't acknowledged what that meant. It hurt. The familiar, ravaging pain clutched at his chest, overwhelming him in this time of realization, and he struggled not to get swept up in it. This wasn't the time to be swallowed by the dark emotions. He'd been given another chance to make things right. And maybe it wouldn't be the ones he remembered. But his friends would live a happy life this time. That mattered. As much as it hurt Cloud personally, he didn't regret this chance to make it right. It didn't ease the loneliness, though. It was the small things he missed most. Things like Tifa calling him down to sweep the floors for her, or saying, "Have a safe trip," when he left with a package. Marlene tugging on his hand when she wanted to show him something. Denzel's quiet, welcoming smile, and the occasional lazy day spent working on Fenrir, with the boy crouched at his side, curious and wondering. Barrett might never face the pain of losing his best friend, of having his home, his family, and his comrades ripped away so violently by Shinra. And he would never have Marlene as his little girl, the one who called him Dad. Maybe it wasn't worth everything they'd lost, but the loss of that relationship hurt. Marlene had a special place in Cloud's heart. What with her staying with him and Tifa when Barrett was busy with his job, and he knew she'd been happy with Barrett as her father. The others would be similarly changed. Right now, Sid was not the gruff, disillusioned man Cloud had once met. He was young, ambitious, had his eyes on the stars, and was working with all the enthusiasm he possessed towards reaching them. Cloud had noted in passing talk about the Shinra space program, how in the next few months they were gearing up for their first, and soon to fail, launch. Would Sid get the chance to fulfill his dream? If there was no meteor, there would be no second attempt at a launch. No need for Shinra to try to revive their failed project. What would that mean for the man who Cloud had worked so closely with, who had shared his burden of leader for a while, and who had never hesitated to whack Cloud upside the head with a wrench if he thought Cloud needed it? When Cloud had first gotten Fenrir, he'd spent hours with the pilot, going over every inch of the bike to learn how it worked, how to care for it. Sid had drilled in proper maintenance until Cloud had been tempted to hit him to get him to stop. But the lesson had been well worth the pain, and the companionship had been nice. He missed it. Somewhere out there, Yuffie was running around, feeling the fresh wound of Wutai's defeat to Shinra. Her cheerful attitude had never left her, despite the years of pain she'd grown through. The belligerent teenager who bullied her way into Cloud's life, who dragged him along on her wild path, willingly or unwillingly. Would she wander around forever, looking for a way to save her homeland, stubbornly alone and self-exiled? Would she ever find someone to accept her like their ragtag group had? She'd so willingly followed him after their initial meeting. The loneliness of her self-imposed lifestyle transparent to him even in his muddled mindset at the time. Yuffie was the one to take advantage of blatant kindness and fight tooth and nail against any cruelty. But somehow Cloud had been able to find a balance in the middle that she accepted, which later grew into a friendship and mutual respect. She would never be anything less than a free spirit, and he'd been content with her tendency to whirl in and out of his life at her own whim. A distant noise, nearly lost over the sound of the wind, managed to reach Cloud's ears. He glanced down the length of Shinra's tower, unmoved by the vertigo the long drop induced. Nothing interesting caught his unfocused gaze, but the sight of the distant rows of windows brought to mind another. Neat suit, carefully groomed hair, and dark, intelligent eyes. Reeve had changed, much like the Turks had, only thanks to the greater threat to the world. Through the robotic Kate Sith, he'd reached out and seen a world he'd not known outside of Shinra's reach. Cloud's first face-to-face meeting with the man had happened long after everything had calmed down. After the repairs had been underway, and their conflict was a thing of the past. It had been somewhat awkward. Reeve, in person, was nothing like the joke-cracking robot he piloted. There was a shadow of regret in him, but there was also a hardness and determination, one that could be used for right or wrong. It was a side that Reeve didn't often show other people. That was the point of the disguise, of course. Without the unifying threat that Meteor and Sephiroth had presented, would Reeve remain trapped in Shinra's politics? Would he learn to flourish, or would he instead be crushed into conformity and corruption? Reeve was utterly urban, but he was a jokester, a trickster underneath it all. He had an enchanted mind, one that craved fun and games, but also the complexity of life. His job had been to look after the people, from his family to total strangers. When it came down to it, he'd made a huge difference in the world. How would the planet fare if Reeve wasn't there to take the helm when all was said and done? Perhaps it would turn as dark and lonely as it had been for Vincent. The years hadn't been kind to him. He had more reason than most to be bitter. From the betrayal from those he considered closest to him, to his disillusionment of what was right in the world. From there, he'd been locked away from the world and hadn't fought the isolation, as he'd felt he deserved it as penance for a wrong he'd not been able to prevent. He was also the only person who hated Hojo more than Cloud did. Maybe it was those connections that had drawn Vincent to their ragtag group of rebels. Or maybe it was a chance at seeing what had become of Lucretia's son that had stirred him from his self-imposed prison. Cloud had never gotten a straight answer out of Vincent as to why he'd ultimately joined their cause. His claim of vengeance against Hojo didn't explain why he'd continued to stay with them long after the scientist's death. Whatever the reason, it had given Vincent the chance to meet Lucretia one last time, to face his misguided guilt that he'd caused her downfall. She'd been as much part of the decision for allowing her son to become an experiment as Hojo had been. The reunion had been bittersweet to witness, but it would have been lost entirely if Vincent had remained in his long sleep, dreaming of redemption he could never receive. Was that to be Vincent's fate here? Cloud had the knowledge of exactly where to go, what needed to be said to get Vincent to fall into step beside him. He felt like a puppet master with the ability to manipulate people, his friends' emotions. It made him sick. And what of Nanaki? His inclusion in Cloud's life had been accidental at first, a side effect of Aerith's rescue. Cloud wouldn't have left him behind, not once he knew Nanaki hadn't been a creature of Hojo's divining. But Nanaki had chosen of his own accord to stay with them, to continue their near hopeless quest against an enemy he knew nothing of. It had been Bugenhagen's entreaty to Cloud that had given Nanaki the chance to learn the truth behind his father's death. The shame he'd carried for so many years had been lifted, and Cloud knew how powerful such a release was. Would it be the same, mean the same, if Cloud found a way to set up the events again, knowing what he did now? Did he have any right to? Nanaki may have been older than Cloud physically, but he was younger in spirit, and that brought a quiet wisdom to the team. It was through Nanaki that Cloud had learned much of his love of the planet. Many of their nights had been spent around a campfire, listening to tales that Bugenhagen had told Nanaki, and he'd then passed on to them. While Cloud knew his friends never resented him for his mistakes, he felt that it would be dishonoring them if he tried to selfishly recreate their future, using his knowledge. By the same token, he couldn't place them on untouchable pedestals, as he had Zack and Aerith. He needed heroes and angels in his life then. Needed them to be more than simple human beings, for what they stood for and what they sacrificed for. They never resented him for it, understood the need and the coping mechanism for what it was. But it had already brought Cloud grief between he and the Zack of this time for his inability to separate the two. Cloud's chest ached for the Zack he'd left behind, the one who he didn't really know, who had sacrificed himself to protect his dreams, his honor, and Cloud's life. Now it was easier to think of that man and this Zack as two different people. For as close to his heart as Cloud kept the Zack of his old life, it was the closeness of two people who had been through a terrible hardship together. It was so very different than the camaraderie, the friendship he enjoyed now. The emotions he felt for the hero who'd saved his life, who'd been a shield between him and the world when he hadn't been able to handle it, had grown stronger for that distinction. His memories of the man who'd died for him, and the forgiveness he'd craved for and received. Those feelings would never leave him, and he'd always be thankful to the other Zack for what he'd done. But now he was well and truly gone, not just lost to death, but lost to this new chance Cloud had been given. It was more final. There would be no more waking dreams, no more feeling that familiar otherworldly comfort at his back, offering to back him up when he was too overwhelmed. He'd had to give that up to get the living, vibrant Zack he now had. It was worth it, but it still hurt to lose. Loss wasn't a new feeling. His entire life was defined by his losses. The loss of his dreams of joining Soldier, the loss of his hometown, his mother, his heroes, the loss of Aerith. He had felt so light after he'd realized, had accepted that she forgave him, that his best had been enough for her. Her strength in life and her calm guidance in death had always been with him. Times when he'd felt lost, that he'd needed a helping hand he couldn't reach out for from his friends. She'd always been there at the edge of his consciousness. Cloud had built a life, had fought hard and won against impossible odds. And even if it wasn't perfect, it had been his. He couldn't regret the second chance he was given to make things right for his worst failures. Zack, Aerith, and even Sephiroth. But it was hard not to feel resentful. Whatever had drawn him to this time had saved his life. Perhaps it had been Aerith, his beloved and dearly missed friend he hadn't been able to save. She had reached out to him from the live stream before, worried and cajoling him to let go of his guilt and regret. The thought didn't sit right with Cloud, though. She had wanted him to live on, to let go of the past and move into the future, a future that was turning out very different than he'd envisioned. If Cloud had thought about it at all, he would have imagined something similar to what he left behind. Tifa working at her bar with Denzel and Marlene, Sid flying the skies in his ever-improving airships, Barrett continuing his dream of rebuilding his hometown, and somewhere in there, Zack and Aerith living together peacefully, Where in there was there room for a handful of curiously loyal Shinra soldiers, an excitable young chocobo, or others? While he loved the shy, budding woman Aerith was now, he ached for the Aerith he knew, who deepened her connection to the planet so much that she'd been able to reach him even after she'd died. Part of him kept wishing that she'd be able to reach him here, across time. It was a vain hope, though. There was no reason for his Aerith to still exist. He'd already changed so much. There would be no reason for Aerith of this time to sacrifice herself for the world. He didn't want her to. Not just because the loss would hurt, but because it wouldn't bring back the Aerith he'd lost. Accepting that reality hurt as much as her death had. Cloud sat for a while, not thinking about anything, just letting the ache pulse through him. The wind continued to pull at his clothes and whip at his hair. He wished the bitter chill had more of an effect on him. He already felt numb, but the discomfort would have been a welcome distraction right now. The bottle in his hand nearly slipped from his grip as the wind tugged at it, and his hand tightened spasmodically around the neck. After a moment, he brought it up to his mouth, but didn't tip it back to drink just yet. Despite the turbulent air, he still caught the whiff of the bitter scent of alcohol before the breeze snatched it away. With it, the smell brought memories of Tifa. She had run her bar with a firm hand, always welcoming, but tough and no nonsense about her business. After a while, word got round of the barkeeper who served the best variety of drinks, whose prices were fair, and who was able to take on the rowdiest patrons without breaking a sweat over it. Tifa had been proud of her achievement, happy in the little slice of life she carved out for herself. When Barrett had worried over keeping Marlene safe and occupied while he was busy with his hometown's reconstruction, she'd offered them her home without hesitation. Marlene had been thrilled, as she loved spending time with her favorite people besides her dad. Even with the burden of taking care of another person, Tifa had never wavered in her responsibilities. When Cloud had become restless over staying trapped in one place for so long, and had begun his delivery service, she had supported him in spite of her growing unease and his deepening depression and isolation. She was such a strong person. Yet Cloud had hurt her time and again with his thoughtlessness and selfishness. After the remnants had been taken care of, and with the cure for geostigma readily at hand, things had also begun to improve for them. Cloud had moved back into the bar, started making his deliveries again, and Tifa had been happy to see him doing better. There were still times he retreated in on himself, but he'd been able to be there for Tifa in a way his crippled emotions hadn't allowed for before. And he'd been hopeful. There were still wounds between them, things that still needed to be said for both of them to heal, and given time they would have. He'd let go and forgive himself, for his sake, for Aerith's and Zack's, for Tifa's. Above all, she was the one who deserved Cloud's atonement the most, for staying so close and always offering herself to help him. He had pushed that away, and she hadn't known how to stop him. He'd taken advantage of that, though it hadn't been a conscious decision. For as competent a fighter as she was, and a successful businesswoman, Tifa also had problems expressing her emotions. When she hesitated in her want to help him, he had moved beyond her reach instead of reaching back for her. So many of his regrets were for her, and he'd thought he'd have time to atone for them. Now he never would. Tifa would live a life sheltered in Nibelheim, and would never know the bitter struggle that had drawn them together. Cloud held the bottle out in front of him, staring at the darkened glass as it reflected the green glow of the Mako reactors. He could just see the liquid inside, sloshing against his movements. Tifa had a tradition she insisted upon, that every year they would drink a toast in remembrance of those they'd lost. For Nibelheim and their lost families. For Jessie, Biggs and Wedge, their lost companions in their early struggle. For Aerith and Zack, who had died so others could live. Now he had other names to add to that list. Each one tearing a little bit further into his heart. Barrett, Marlene, Sid, Yuffie, Nanaki, Reeve, Vincent, Tifa, Denzel. A low, wounded sound escaped Cloud, and he hunched in on himself. The loss of Denzel hurt most of all. It would have been better if it had been death that separated them, as painful as the thought was. Because then there was a chance Cloud would be able to see him again. If he was allowed to join his loved ones after death. Everyone returned to the planet, and no one was ever lost completely in the endless cycle of the life stream. Now there would never be a reunion with his family. They were beyond his reach. They were beyond the reach of even death. And the only thing left of them were the cold, fading memories in Cloud's mind. He clung to those memories, trying to preserve everything he could remember of Denzel. His face, his winsome smile, the color of his eyes, his hair. He tucked the images away into his mind, wishing, not for the first time, that memories weren't all he had. How long would it be before they faded away? Cloud had lost himself for a while after Meteor Fall. He hadn't known what to do anymore. The feelings of restlessness and guilt had grown, and he'd had no way to alleviate the emotions that piled darker and darker in his mind. Then Denzel had found him, and Cloud had thought just for a while, that maybe Aerith had sent Denzel to him, to give him purpose in a world he wasn't sure how he fit in anymore. At first he'd treasured the boy because of that. Then Denzel had eased his way into Cloud's heart, and he'd forgotten anything else but that he wanted. He wanted Denzel to be safe and happy, for him to be rid of the suffering from geostigma. It was a timer on his life, ticking the minutes away until his young body would succumb to the painful infection. The more Cloud studied and learned of what exactly geostigma was, what it was doing to people's bodies, the more he feared for the child. If Denzel died of the disease, he wouldn't return to the planet, or to Aerith's gentle care. He'd be lost forever. It had been obsession that drove Cloud to greater lengths to find a cure, and each failure dropped him further into black despair. He hadn't been able to protect himself from succumbing to the disease. So how could he protect the small life he'd sworn to cherish? Redemption had been twofold during the altercation with the remnants and the other. Cloud had found the forgiveness he longed for, that no one but himself had begrudged him of it, and they'd been given the cure he'd sought so long to find. Denzel's smile was bright in his mind's eye, freed from the constant pain as Aerith's healing water soothed away the infection. When everything had calmed down, they had returned to their home in Tifa's bar. Cloud had spent a quiet night at Denzel's bedside, talking softly with him. Marlene slept in the next bed over, curled up with Tifa, who watched them with large, happy eyes. Denzel hadn't let go of Cloud's hand, even when he dropped into an exhausted sleep, and Cloud had stayed. He'd stayed, and he should have stayed before. Cloud had had to ask Denzel's forgiveness too, for abandoning him. Denzel's life had been filled with too many abrupt ends, too many people leaving him behind. Tifa had been there, true, and Marlene, but it had been Cloud that Denzel had found. Cloud, who Denzel saw as his savior, and Cloud's abandonment that had hurt him. Now he had a second chance to give Denzel the life he should have had, one where he grew up with his parents, happy and without the pain of horror and loss. He wouldn't need Cloud, wouldn't know him. The worst part was that Cloud wanted to have his Denzel instead, and the guilt of the desire weighed heavily on his mind. What kind of person was he to wish misfortune because he couldn't give up one single connection he treasured? Cold wetness on Cloud's cheek brought him back to himself, and he reached up a hand that shook only slightly to wipe away the tear tracks that trailed down his face. It didn't matter anymore, except to him. Those people he'd fought with, lived with, and loved were gone, and would never return. Cloud had learned his lesson with Zack, that they were different, and could not be the people he left behind. He couldn't ask for the impossible. Bringing the bottle to his mouth, Cloud tilted his head back and took a long draught of the bitter wine. Memories of Tifa's comforting support and Denzel's beloved admiration teased at his mind. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and he'd have to return to Zack's solid support and the precarious path they were traveling. Tonight he would mourn those he'd lost. He would give himself that much closure. The list had lengthened, but he would do everything he could so that it wouldn't grow any further.